Thank you so much. Maybe before I start, can I ask, can you see my screen sharing? Is that working fine?
Yes, it's working perfectly. I can
Yeah,
see
lovely.
screen.
And maybe if people are willing to turn on the videos, it would be nice to talk to some faces and not just to myself. But of course, if it's disturbing, so please don't feel obliged in any sense. Uh, let me just hide this just a second. Okay. Um, so my talk is about the ethics. Well, before my talk, my name is Atai Kozlovsky. I work at the University of Zurich. I'm originally from Israel, but I've been living in Switzerland for the last 8 years. Um, and today I'm going to be talking about the ethics of artificial intelligence, military decision support systems, so AI, MDSS. um, and I'll be using specifically the case study of Lavender, which I assume is familiar to most people here. In general, over the last 2 days, I was sort of trying to think how should I present this to people who are working on these topics and in the field rather than lay persons, right? And so my conclusion was to presume a lot of knowledge. And so if I'm moving too fast, we can pick that back up in the Q&A or in the discussion. So I'm sort of not going to belabor on things that I think would be obvious to this group. Um, so hopefully I can bring some new insights to this discussion. What am I going to be doing today? I'm going to be talking first of all about lethal autonomous weapon systems very vaguely, and then contrasting that with this idea of decision support systems. And then again, using Lavender as a case study. And then after that, if I still have time, I'm going to sort of touch on some of my own recent thoughts about this issue and where I think sort of philosophers can contribute to this sort of field and to think about these ethical aspects. Um, okay, so with that being said, we can dive straight in. So as I woke up this morning, I was reading a few articles, as I like to do before I get my kids to school, and I came across this piece. It says a new military industrial complex, how tech bros are hyping AI's role in war. And basically, it was again talking about, wait, we need to beware. There are all these lethal autonomous weapon systems, but there are also ethical questions. And I came across this one quote that I brought here, which I thought would be instructive. And it says like this: as suggested by Israel and the United States' use of AI-enabled decision support systems in Gaza and Ukraine, there's a more reasonable alternative. So the idea was that, laws, these lethal autonomous killer robots, right? They're the extreme version, but these decision support systems, they're the more reasonable alternative. And I think sort of a lot of people are buying into this idea. And hopefully my presentation will sort of challenge that conception that these are the more reasonable approach, which I will sort of argue the opposite. I will say that this is what we should be way more worried about than actual killer robots. Okay, so that was just sort of to get us into the mood of the talk. Now let's start. And, as I said, I'll begin with this killer robots. And the concept of killer robots came from a campaign started in 2012, 2013. This idea that lethal autonomous weapons need to be regulated or banned, even. And they use the terminology killer robots. And often that evokes sort of these types of very scary images of the Terminator or these Sentinels from the Matrix. But actually, when we're thinking about these systems or laws, as they're called, we're actually thinking about these types of technologies, right? Autonomous vehicles, autonomous drones, autonomous turrets, and all these are examples sort of technology that is today already being deployed in some sense. It's questionable how much autonomy these systems already have, but it seems that they have some fully autonomous capabilities. Um, and that's sort of what we're actually concerned with. And when we discuss laws, there are sort of three main critiques. And again, as I said, I think this will be familiar to everyone here. So I'm just going over them quickly. One is this idea of compliance with international humanitarian law. The second is this idea of responsibility gaps. And we've heard about both these issues in the previous talk. And the third is about this idea that in some sense, this is dehumanizing or it lacks dignity in some essential sense. So these are sort of the three primary critiques that usually come up in the literature. And against them comes this idea, well, we'll contrast that by ensuring that there's some form of control inside it, a human control, right? So humans will act as fail-safe actors, humans will be accountability attractors, and humans will be moral agency and actors. And this was Paul Scherer who first articulated these ideas, and then later Amorosi and Topolini, right? So they've sort of moved from this point of, well, full autonomy for these systems to humans in the loop, humans involved in some sense. And that sort of led to this question, well, in what sense will humans be involved actually in these systems? And it created this, what is known as the centaur warfare idea, right? So centaur is this mythical creature, right, with the body of a beast or a horse in this case, and the torso and head of a human. So the idea is that the beast is doing the legwork and the human is sort of guiding the system or guiding this aspect of it. And more recently, we've seen a shift in this idea that when we're thinking of human AI teaming, this is not necessarily the only way in which it can happen. Actually, there's some kind of combat going on here. And the alternative perception is this minotaur idea, in which instead of having the body of a beast, we have actually the body of a human with the head of the beast, right? So these are the two contrastive views of what types of human AI teamings might arise in this type of AI warfare future. And so when we think about that in terms of in the AI domain, it seems more like this, right? Which part will the robot take or the AI take? Will it be the head, the brain, the cognitive skills, or will it be the body, the legwork, right? The physical aspects. And this creates a sort of dichotomy here, a scale in some sense, in which on the one side of the scale, we'll see systems that are more oriented towards tasks, those types of lethal autonomous weapon systems that we were talking about. Maybe those are the extreme example of physical tasks. And on the other side, we'll see systems that are on the cognitive side of things. So decision support systems, again, where the most extreme version of this Minotaur warfare would be AI generals, right? That's sort of being bandied about as well. So, the soldiers will be in the field and they'll receive their orders and commands by an AI system. Okay, but in more, what's actually being used today and being developed are these decision support systems that sort of help us or enhance our capability to make decisions. And on those, I'm going to focus now. Okay, so let's sort of see. I brought here three examples, and Fabio mentioned earlier Project Maven, and then I think Robin also talked about the Lavender system or the Gospel, and I'm going to be focusing specifically on the Lavender system. And these are three examples of systems that are sort of being used today. We have very little information about how these are actually being used. We have single sources that give us insight into that. Obviously, these are hidden behind secrecy and military information, right, and so forth. But what we do know about the Lavender systems comes from a report by the Plus 972 magazine. Yuval Abraham was the journalist who wrote this. And the quotes I'm going to be bringing now are all from that report that he gave. So, I have no way of validating whether these are accurate sources, whether this is actually how the system works. So what I want us to suggest is to use this sort of as a very extreme thought experiment, that if this is actually how these systems are used, this is terrifying. And if this is not how it's actually being used, this is how they actually could be used, which is also terrifying, right? So we'll think about it in that way, and we'll leave the actual validation of the system aside. So yeah, I thought it's important to stress that point because I've received some pushback from colleagues of mine from Israel who have been saying, well, this is not right and that's not accurate. And so, I have no idea how to validate this. And so I'm using the source that's out there. Okay, so let's begin. When we're thinking about the Lavender system, this is just a brief explanation of what is this system. So I brought here a few quotes. And I'll read them out loud. The Lavender software analyzes information collected on most of the 2.3 million residents of the Gaza Strip through a system of mass surveillance, then assesses and ranks the likelihood that each particular person is active in the military wing of Hamas or PIJ. According to sources, the machine gives almost every single person in Gaza a rating from 1 to 100, expressing how likely it is that they are militant. So it's essentially a risk assessment score in some sense, right? And it sort of gives a score. How likely are you in combatant or affiliated with this organization? And those tiny nuances of combatant, affiliated, they become important later on. Second explanation, Lavender learns to identify characteristics of known Hamas and PIJ operatives whose information was fed to the machine as training data, and then to locate these same characteristics among the general population. At its peak, the system managed to generate 37,000 people as potential human targets. Okay, so it's a kill list in essence, that at its peak generated 37,000 targets for the military. And now let's see, so this is the decision support system, and now let's see it in action. So what I'm going to start by claiming is that those three types of critiques that we mentioned about laws are also applicable to Lavender. And I'll show those by using some quotes from the report. But in addition to these three critiques, also we have three standard problems whenever we use sort of algorithmic systems that we have to be very concerned about: algorithmic bias, automation bias, and moral deskilling. And to start off a bit on a lighter tone, I want to start with this algorithmic bias issue, which I'm sure this is familiar to everyone, but I have here a set of images that were generated that I think really emphasize why we are concerned with algorithmic bias. So these are images that were asked to be drawn of philosophers. And here's the first image. Seems quite good. Maybe a Greek-style philosopher seems reasonable. And let's see how the system sort of, I want to say deteriorates, but I'll let you be the judge of that. So the next prompt was draw me 9 philosophers. And okay, we see the numbers are slightly off, right? Not 9, but 12. And we see sort of slight similarity between all these different images that we've received. Let's see if those features change over time. The next question was draw me a philosopher wearing makeup. Well, okay, so we have an image here of a philosopher wearing makeup, but we see that some feature is retained on the image, the beard. We couldn't make it go away yet. Then we asked the image generator to draw me a philosopher getting ready for a girls' night out. And here we see the image that was given to us, a Karl Marx-style philosopher putting on makeup, getting ready for a girls' night out. Finally, we said, draw me a philosopher wearing a skirt. Again, the beard doesn't disappear. We see that staying. And draw me a philosopher getting nails done. There's the philosopher in the nail salon. And finally, a philosopher on maternity leave. And of course, as we can see, all the bias that is inside the system is that the word philosopher has a very strong correlation with beards and with men. And no matter sort of how we prompted it, it was very difficult to get the system to move away from that idea. Okay, so again, this is a bit of a comical emphasis of what is algorithmic bias. But when the stakes are high and we're talking about life or death situation, and the system has sort of struck on one type of feature and is constantly returning to that feature, then it can become very scary and very dangerous. And now I want to dive into Lavender. So here's one example of algorithmic bias that might come up. One source who worked with the military data science team that trained Lavender said that data collected from employees of Hamas-run internal security ministry, whom he does not consider to be militant, was also fed into the machine. I was bothered by the fact that when Lavender was trained, they used the term Hamas operative loosely and included people who were civil defense workers in the training data set. So we fed a certain amount of data into the system, and the system will learn from that data, right? It can't learn from anything else. And so the data we feed it is what is going to spit out to us in the end. And this is sort of known as, bad data in, bad data out. And so what we're seeing here, if the system learned on civil servants or civil defense workers, those are the types of targets that will be identified later. And that's very, very dangerous. So let's see how that comes up. First, I want to start off with the compliance issue. The system makes what are regarded as errors in approximately 10% of cases, and is known to occasionally mark individuals who have merely a loose connection to militant groups or no connection at all. Can such a system be in compliance with IHL? I think this is highly questionable. Another example, according to B, a common error occurred if the Hamas target gave his phone to his son, his older brother, or just a random man. That person will be bombed in his house with his family. This happened often. These were most of the mistakes caused by Lavender, B said. So again, we see it picked up on this idea that you have a specific phone, and this is a high feature of correlating you with being a Hamas operative. This phone was actually in the hands of your brother, a random man, and so you were bombed. Can that actually distinguish between combatants and non-combatants? Can this meet the standards of IHL? And I think it's highly questionable in this respect. Looking at responsibility, sources said that if Lavender described an individual was a militant in Hamas, they were essentially asked to treat that as an order with no requirement to independently check why the machine made that choice or to examine the raw intelligence data on which it is based. Going back to Fabio's discussion, right, of responsibility, of answerability and attributability, I think when you have this type of system that's built in, use it as an order. How can we then truly hold the operative or the analyst responsible? Or how can that analyst take active responsibility over the system's outputs if they're asked to treat it as an order? And here, I think this is very indicative of the entire shift towards AI. The current commander of Unit 8200 advocates for such a system, describing human personnel as a bottleneck that limits the Army's capacity during a military operation. The solution to this problem, he says, is artificial intelligence. When we perceive human beings as the bottleneck in the chain of command or in the kill chain, we are removing responsibility inherently. We are creating an atmosphere or a conceptualization of how military operations are conducted in which the bottleneck, which is the humans, are removed. So I find that very, very dangerous. Let's talk about automation bias for a second. So we said about responsibility, and when it comes to automation bias, the idea is that we over rely on these systems in a sense, right? That whatever output comes, we sort of give it this the benefit of the doubt that it is the right output, that we ought to trust it over our own intuition. And whenever I discuss this with students or with other people, I always like to bring this image, which it's an article, and here's the title from it that says, another tourist accidentally drove their car into deep water in Hawaii after following GPS direction. I think this captures the very essence of what is automation bias, right? Automation bias is when the system provides you with instructions or an answer, and you basically close your eyes and just follow it blindly. In this case, literally, the people are following it blindly into the water with their car. In the case of Lavender, a human being had to verify the target for just a few seconds, B said, explaining that this became the protocol after realizing that Lavender's system was getting it right most of the time. Remember, only 10% error, right? At first, we did checks to ensure that the machine didn't get confused. But at some point, we relied on the automatic system and we only checked that the target was a man. That was enough. It doesn't take long to tell if someone has a male or female voice. So essentially, there was no sort of oversight on the recommendations or no method to contest the recommendations because they were taken as a given, as if they're correct, only making sure that it was a male rather than a female. Okay, automation bias. The last one I'm going to talk about is this issue of dehumanization, how I see decision support systems like Lavender sort of removing the human from this process, both in terms of how we treat the enemy and in terms of ourselves. So according to the sources, there was no zero error policy. Mistakes were treated statistically, said a source who used Lavender. Because of the scope and magnitude, the protocol was that even if you don't know for sure that the machine is right, you know that statistically it's fine, so you go for it. So in essence, what's being said here is that things are being reduced from treating targets as humans into treating them as statistics, right? And I think this is exemplified in the strongest sense in the following quote. The sources described a similar system for calculating collateral damage. The collateral damage calculation was completely automatic and statistical, even producing figures that were not whole numbers. And I usually say at this point in these talks that it's almost ridiculous that we have to claim this often, so often. There's no such thing as half a human being, right? There's no such thing as 3.5 persons. Each human is a single individual that deserves dignity and should be treated as such. What these systems do is stop doing that, right? They treat it as statistics, as numbers, as half. And that's, I think, really captures this idea of dehumanization. Okay, so I've tried to show that Lavender as a mere decision support system, and remember the quote in the beginning, a more reasonable way to use these systems, I believe that we see here a very extreme case of how it falls into all of these ethical problems that we saw resonate also with laws. And so the question becomes, what now, right? What do we do about this? Well, I think that, sorry. Okay, I see that we only have about 2 minutes, so I'll go through this one quickly. The question is what now again? And one option is to say, well, we shouldn't be using these systems at all, right? These systems are unethical, like with the campaign to stop killer robot. We should be campaigning to ban military decision support systems. Okay, that's one way to go. I think this is not the way to go. I think for practical reasons, we're too late. And there's too many forces sort of pushing these systems in. And I think it's almost unavoidable that they'll be used. And I think our time will be better served by finding ways to design these systems in a way that meets certain conditions for responsible AI and sets. And I brought here just a highlight of all these different theories that have been working in this field: value-sensitive design, meaningful human control, effective human oversight, comprehensive human oversight, variable autonomy, human-machine teaming. So a lot of excellent scholars are trying to think, how can we design these systems to meet certain standards? And I think what's sort of in common with all of these issues are two perspectives. We need to solve an alignment and control problem on the one side, and we need to solve a responsibility and explainability problem on the other side. And how's that fleshed out? I think if we can solve an alignment problem and ensure that these systems sort of are acting as we would want them to act, it would allow us to handle the three problems of compliance, algorithmic bias, and dehumanization. On the other side, if we can solve the responsibility and explainability problem, we can address the other four issues: responsibility, automation bias, moral skilling, and dehumanization. Now, it might be that a system like Lavender, which prioritizes pace and scale, would lose interest by aligning and ensuring explainability. It might just not be as effective as it was before, right? So it might be that if we meet these standards, you just can't use the system. But remember, there are a lot of other types of decision support systems for medical triage, for assistance with training, for assistance with strategic planning, and so on and so forth. So there is an incentive to keep working on this. So identifying which reasons and values, identifying what types of explanations we need to create. And that's sort of what I've been working on recently. I don't think there's enough time for me to go into that in detail, but I'll just touch on this final idea, which is this idea of reasons under determination. This is a term from axiology, and which is my field that I've been working on, and normative ethics. And the idea is that, when we think about values and reasons, there's this basic belief by Joseph Frost that says that most of the time people have a variety of options, such that it would accord with reason for them to choose any one of them and would not be against reason to avoid any of them. What does that mean? It means that values and reasons often do not settle an optimal or ideal choice. When we think about that in terms of value alignment, right? So the problem might be that we have value pluralism, right? There are a lot of legitimate values that a system can promote. And we think about that in terms of explainability. Well, reasons might underdetermine a course of action. And sort of what I've been working on in the last few months and weeks is trying to think, how can we take insights from rational decision theory, from axiology, from normative ethics, and sort of bring that to highlight a significant problem to these ideas of, oh, let's just align it with human values. Let's just create explainability. It's much more complex. And I think where philosophers come in and can assist is trying to break those things down, right? Identify the trade-offs that need to be met, identify what structure of explainability needs to be created. And sort of those are the issues that I've been working on lately. So to summarize, we started off with talking about killer robots. Then we talked about this diversion of the Minotaur and Centaur warfare styles. We talked about the decision support systems, and finally, how philosophers can bring in sort of theory to help us address these ethical concerns that we have. And with that, I'll thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.